Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex, meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations, we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for girls and women.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. This is Elly coming to you from Germany. I'm here with my co-host, Sybil over in the US, and today we have a special guest. Derrick Jensen is the co-founder of Deep Green Resistance, a movement that argues for the dismantling of industrial civilization to prevent global ecocide and to return to a sustainable relationship with the planet. He's the author of over 20 books, including Endgame, The Culture of Make-Believe, A Language Older Than Words, and Bright Green Lies. He was named one of Utne Reader's 50 Visionaries Who Are Changing Your World, won the Eric Hoffer Award in 2008, and has been hailed by Democracy Now! As the poet-philosopher of the ecology movement. Thank you, Derrick, for being with us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you both for your own work.
So as listeners know, the topic that we focus on is commercial sexual exploitation, but we believe this is something deeply intertwined really with every facet of our culture, and that includes our relationship to the planet, to everything that lives on it, to the land. And there is so much to talk about today here, untangling these connections, the overlap between trying to do ecological protection and trying to protect women and girls and some men and boys from commercial and non-commercial sexual violence. And I'm going to give my own mini spiel, my mini essay on what I think is happening, and then I will turn it over to you, Derrick, which is first thing that comes to my mind when I think of these intersecting issues. I'm thinking of how Gerda Lerner writes about how sexual slavery arises when the human relationship to the land changes, when we become agricultural-based, sedentary, class societies, hierarchical, militaristic, how everything that grows from that, the resource extraction, mining camps, etc., that coexists with a lot of trafficking, prostitution, exploitation of local and indigenous women. Whenever armies go, they extract resources, but they don't just treat the land, it's animals and plants, lumber, etc., resources. They also do this to women and girls. Another potent example, power conquers a new territory. They bring back home plants and animals as trophies. But they also do this to women and girls. One very famous example being Sarah Bartman, who was a local woman exploited and trafficked all over Europe, really, from what is today South Africa. We'll cover her story in a future episode. So there's so much there. There's the modern rhetoric we see about women from Venezuela and Greenland. We have men talking about how they'd like to turn these places into sex tourist paradise. It goes so far as when the countries themselves are represented in all these horrible AI images that I keep seeing everywhere. The country itself, Venezuela or Greenland, is represented by the young indigenous woman. And there's a tug of war of men, like Denmark and US, for Greenland, for instance, right? This is what we see. So I wanted to ask you, Derrick, how did the connection between ecocide and femicide, between all these systems, when did you realize this is connected, this is important, and how has your thought on that developed over the years?
Well, it probably began viscerally when I was a kid with, my father was extremely violent. He broke my sister's arm. My brother has epilepsy from blows to the head. Raped my mother, my sister, and me. I, of course, couldn't articulate this as a kid, but I was basically asking, if his behavior isn't making him happy, why is he doing it? This just seems counterintuitive and counterproductive. Again, I, of course, didn't have that language at 5 and 6 and 7, but that was the question that hung in the air. Simultaneously, I guess when I was about second grade, so it's 7, 8, whenever that is, they put in a subdivision next to where I lived. And I remember thinking, if they keep doing this, where will all the meadowlarks go? And where will all the cottonwoods go and the garter snakes and the ants? So I didn't have this language, but the language that eventually emerged is you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And of course, the same sort of question hung in the air. It's like, this isn't making us happy. And so why are we doing it? And then I get to high school and college. And when I was younger, I had this hobby or habit to ask people I met. I would just, like, if I saw somebody on a bus or if I just, making conversation with strangers, I would ask, do you like your job? And about 90% said no. And I kept thinking, what does it mean when the vast majority of people spend the vast majority of waking hours doing things they don't want to do? None of it was making any sense to me. So I just started asking questions. And it's like a friend of mine, John Osborne, often says that a lot of activists begin by trying to protect a specific piece of ground, and they end up questioning the foundations of Western civilization. Because if you ask, why is this land being destroyed? Then that leads to the question, why does land get destroyed? That leads to the question, has every culture destroyed its land? And does every culture believe it owns land? It's its land. It leads to the question of, how did the world get to be so full of life and so full of so much beauty if everybody does this? And we can see those same progressions, that if somebody asks, why is this woman raped? Then that will lead to the question, why is any woman raped? And that will lead to the question of, have there been cultures where there is no rape? That will lead to, are there species with no rape? It was like, so why does rape happen? Once these questions start, if you will hang with them, they'll never stop. And you'll get to as close as you can to understand their origins. I mean, there's a lot we can get into with this, but I think I want to start with perception. There's this great line by a Canadian lumberman that is, when I look at trees, I see dollar bills. And if when you look at trees, you see dollar bills, you're going to treat them one way. And if when you look at trees, you see trees, you'll treat them another way. The same is true for anything. There was an article in the local newspaper. I live near the coast, and there was an article in the local newspaper 20 years ago about the reason crabbers work so hard during the crabbing season, which is that at the time, crabs were worth about $1.50 each. And the journalist said, so if you saw all these envelopes on the ground, each one with $1.50 in it, you'd run around picking up those envelopes as fast as you can. And that's true, but a crab is not an envelope full of $1.50. A crab is a creature with his life as valuable to it as yours is to you and mine is to me. That doesn't mean nobody can ever eat crab. Life feeds off life. It just means that if you see the other as this individual, you're going to treat it differently than if you see this other as a resource. But this is one reason among many that I've written so much against pornography. One of the things that pornography does is it teaches men to perceive women as orifices. And if when I look at a woman, I see orifices, I'm going to treat her one way. And if when I look at a woman, I see a woman, I'm going to treat her a different way. And if when I look at this particular woman, I see this particular woman, I'm going to treat her differently still. So there's a start to it. As I said, there's a bazillion directions we can go. I'd be interested in which of those directions you might want me to go.
This is so huge, so complex. There's always so many directions. And I myself, I have a lot of disjointed thoughts, and I know there's a red thread there, but I find it hard to draw it out sometimes. I resonate with what you said. Like, you ask people, do you like your job? And 90% say no. We get used to things we shouldn't get used to. It's kind of incredible. I really think that the entire culture that we live in is dissociative. This is especially obvious now that a lot of us spend more times on screen than off, which is in a short time an incredible development. And we feel very attached to these screens. A lot of our sexuality begins on these screens now, right? I'm just on the cusp of that generation that grew up, and our first exposure to sexuality is stumbling upon hardcore pornography online. And this does something profound to our relationship to our own bodies, to the opposite sex, to how we have relationships or fail to have them now, as we see, like huge relationship breakdown. And I want to bring in another example that I know ties in. I just don't quite yet have the words to describe it. That is, you're right, I see this violence happening to women online through screens, and that I've made it in my activism that it isn't seemingly far away. But if I just left it there and looked the other way and just carried on with my life, it would be. And I know that this connects to the fact that close to where I live, there is a forest, and it's a huge monoculture, as almost all forest is across Germany, and it's dying. and everything that lives in it is dying. But I only know this because I saw it on the news, on a screen. I have no relationship to this forest, even though it's just a couple of hills over. And I know that some generations ago, it would not have been like this. Of course, the patriarchy and rape culture is unfortunately thousands of years old. Can you help me make sense of what I just said? Can you find a red thread in all that I've just thrown at you there?
Well, I can see a bunch of threads, and whether I can untangle them is a whole other question. One of them is that it's pretty clear to me that we have an entire culture that has what Judith Herman calls complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD can be a response to a one-time trauma where, for example, my mom and I were in a terrible car wreck in 1986 or so, where we were driving in a dark, rainy canyon at night, and I hit an overturned semi-load of lumber, just flipped over, and I hit it. And my mom was very badly injured, broke her neck, it was hangman's break. She was lucky to be alive. From then on, whenever we would drive through a dark, rainy canyon at night, or whenever I would drive through a dark, rainy canyon at night, she would always tell me to slow way down more than was necessary, because dark, rainy canyons, there's a trigger that she's, again, now scared of dark, rainy canyons. And that's sort of a classic example of PTSD. But Judith Herman asked, what happens to those who don't suffer a one-time event, like you're in an earthquake and your house falls around you and you survive, or one time you're walking down the street and you get mugged, or what happens if this trauma is not one time but repeated? What happens to captives? And by this she meant prisoners, political prisoners. She meant victims of domestic violence, victims of trafficking, people who are traumatized repeatedly. It's a great question. What's the difference between a one-time trauma and a long-term trauma where you are held powerless? And she found that there were some other effects that can come from this. One of them is that you come to believe that there are no such things as fully mutual relationships. All relationships are based on power, where the strong do as they will, the weak get by as they can. It perfectly describes, like, for example, the selfish gene theory. It describes what everybody says about capitalism. It describes how we perceive evolution to work, which I'm not saying that evolution doesn't work. I'm saying that the notion that evolution is based on those who exploit the best, there are little elements of truth in it, but it ignores that those creatures who have survived in the long run, and the way you survive in the long run is by actually improving your habitat and entering into relationships with all of those neighbors. That salmon improve forests simply by being here. And they improve the forest on its own terms, and the forest improves the health of the salmon, and they give to each other. This is not cosmic or woo-woo. So the point is that if you've been traumatized, you can come to believe that all relationships are based on power, and you can come to despise other victims, that you can come to live in a dissociated sense. You can come to believe that the stories you tell are more important than what really happened, because, of course, that's how abused children get through the day. That's how people who are in prison get through the day. That's how our people who are being constantly abused. I want to sort of drop that in, and then I want to go another direction with it, which is that one of the, I think, most powerful ideas that has guided this culture for a long time, and is a perfect articulation of the dissociated mind, is what's called the Great Chain of Being. And the Great Chain of Being holds that pure mind, God, is at the top, and God is pure mind. And don't get caught up in the religious language. That's not what's important here. God, or the abstract mind, is at the top of a hierarchy of perfection. And then the angels are below that, and then men are below that, and then women are below that. And men and women are both a battleground of beautiful mind versus corrupt body versus mindless body. And then below that are animals, and below that are plants, and then below that are the soil, sand, and, all that stuff. We can say, oh, that's just ridiculous. That's just a Greek guy a couple thousand years ago. It doesn't matter. Or that's just old Christianity. Nobody believes that. But think about it for a second. When you think of the greatest inventions of all time, presumably you might think of the lever, the screw, the pump, gunpowder, I don't know. But people don't think about sexual reproduction. They don't think about proprioception. They don't think about photosynthesis. Those weren't invented. They weren't created by the beautiful abstract mind. Or think of the greatest pieces of art. It's going to be Beethoven's Ninth. It's going to be Sistine Chapel. It's going to be Mona Lisa. It's going to be whatever. It's not going to be frog song. It's not going to be bird song. It's not going to be the colors of a sunset or a sunrise. Why? Because that's just nature. That's not real creation. The only thing that counts is when we create it with our mind. You may be thinking, well, that's great, but what does this have to do with either nature or harming women? And there was this astronomer about, 20 years ago, that some guy on TV asked him, why do we need to explore Mars? And he said, to answer that most important question of all, which is, are we all alone? I remember thinking, you idiot. It's like, we're surrounded by all this life. And what would happen if on Mars they found this creature with floppy ears and fur running around? Well, they would test detergent on its eyes. It's like, they get so excited. Oh, we're so close to creating life in a lab. Mr. Frankenstein story. We're so close to creating life in a lab. We've made these enzymes that blah, blah, blah. I got bad news for you. Mice create life all the time, and so do rabbits. Actually, the truth is female mice do it. We have this idea that what women create with their bodies doesn't count. It only counts if a man creates it with his mind. And it only counts if a woman creates it with her mind too. That's a whole other thing. But I was really heavily influenced by Karen Horney's stuff about womb envy, where women have a role. And I'm not saying this is their only role. Women are more important than men in society. Women are more important because if you have 100 people in a community and 49 of them die, and it's 49 women die and no men, so you have 50 men and one woman, your community is dead. If you have one man alive and 50 women, the community continues. You have a genetic bottleneck, but we won't worry about that. That's fine if you recognize, in an ecological sense, men and women have different roles, just like in a buffalo group, men and women have different roles. I'm not saying that they have to stick with the sex-based roles. I'm not going there. What I'm saying is that women are frankly more important. And that's fine if men understand their role. But if men despise women, it's like, well, crap. How do I make myself superior when obviously life goes through them and my role on that is pretty small? Oh, I know. Maybe I'm smarter than they are. I'm not just making this stuff up. Peggy Reeves Sanday, in her book, Female Power and Male Dominance, talked about what are some of the markers of high and low rape cultures. And one of the markers of a high rape culture is where men's tasks are valued more than women's tasks. And it doesn't really matter who does what task. Both of these cultures I'm going to mention, they both treated women poorly. In one of them, men gathered the yams, and the other one, women gathered the yams. Both of them, males dominate women. But in the one where the men gather yams, gathering yams is, oh man, that's great stuff. That's such an important job. And in the one where the women's gather the yams, it's like, wow, that's just crap work. Nobody should do that. So the point is whose roles are valued in society. And this comes back to collectively, we don't value what nature creates. We don't value women. We don't value trees. Trees are worth nothing until they're cut down. Fish in the oceans are worth nothing until they're turned into fish sticks. And that's part of it. And another part of this dissociation that I talk about that I think is really important is I realized about, 30 years ago now that I touch plastic more than I touch flesh. I was sort of introduced to this idea by John Livingston, who talked about how we think of cities as places of sensory overload, but they're not. I mean, they are in a sense, but they're also not, in that even out of a city, think about how many of your sensory perceptions are either created by or filtered through either humans or machines, and how many come from a non-human source. Like right now, I'm sitting inside and I've got a computer in front of me, and there's 2 dogs in the room, but they're domestic, which means they were mediated by humans, but at least they're animals. Other than that, everything here, there's clothes over there, there's dresser drawers over there, and there's some paintings. And then I look out the window, and it's through a window. That's the only wild I see is wild trees out there, but it's through a window. And if the only things you hear and the only things you see are human-made or human-mediated, then you can come to believe that humans are the only ones that matter. We could say the same thing about women. If everything important is created by men, we can come to believe that women don't create anything important. We are profoundly traumatized individually and collectively, and that leads to certain behaviors, leads to less connection. And also, when you're traumatized, when you've been traumatized, the world can become, rightly, very scary. And one of the ways to deal with that profound and real fear is by attempting to control your surroundings. And if you attempt to control your surroundings, that many abusers were abused themselves. There's a couple things going on, I want to say. One of them is that part of the abusive mindset, there's this great line by R.D. Laing. R.D. Laing was a very interesting guy because he articulated perhaps better than anyone else the abusive mindset and the mindset in this sort of dysfunction. And I didn't learn until many years later that he himself was a batterer. One of the things he talked about is, how do you plug a void, plugging a void? And if you have this existential hole, you have this loneliness or this fear that if you could address it, it's too scary to address it, so you fill it with something else. But that you're plugging that void with another void. So the perpetrator thinks, if I can just, they get scared. Don't worry, I'm not empathizing with the perpetrators here, attempting to explain that they think they can fill it, but they can't. So they keep doing the behavior and, in fact, getting worse and worse. We keep thinking that if we just cut down this forest, we'll be okay. If we just conquer this country, we'll be okay. And it's a void plugging a void.
Derrick, you're answering all the questions I didn't know how to ask. And we knew you would. We were like, he's such an expert conversationalist that we knew you would pick up on the thread that we've been talking about. Everything you said really led into my next question, which was about your book, A Language Older Than Words. It affected me really deeply around my understanding of the connection between systems of violence and the severing of communication within the self and in community and with the natural world, and how that severing of communication is a prerequisite for and a result of the violence. At the same time, I was reading a lot of Andrea Dworkin, and she described her experience of being unable to speak, of being rendered mute after the sexual crimes that she had endured. And I had went through something very similar, and your book was instrumental as I regrew my capacity to communicate with myself and the world around me. So could you kind of explain to us a little bit about the relationship between language, trauma, and healing? And from there, I have another question about survivor voices and how to reconnect our ability to hear and speak the truths we've learned about these crimes.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you both for all the questions so far. They've been fantastic. And second, there's a few quotes that I want to say about this. This is all really important stuff. Judith Herman began her great book, Trauma and Recovery, with something to the effect of, there are some violations of the social compact that are too terrible to utter aloud. This is the meaning of the word unspeakable. Now, another quote, I just found this one last time. I'm looking for epigraphs for the book I'm working on, for the work I'm pretty much done with right now. One is by Jeanette Winterson. Unhappy families are conspiracies of silence. The one who breaks the silence is never forgiven. And then one's by Pat Conroy. It has always been difficult for me to face the truth about my childhood because it requires a commitment to explore the lineaments and features of a history I would prefer to forget. For years, I did not have to face the demonology of my youth. I made a simple choice not to and found solace in the gentle palmistry of forgetfulness, a refuge in the cold, lordly glooms of the unconsciousness. But I was drawn back to the history of my family and the failures of my own adult life. So there is a sort of conspiracy of silence. There's a mutual interest between both perpetrator and victim. Both of them, in some ways, want for things not to be said. The perpetrator doesn't want for the atrocity to be talked about because it is a violation of the social compact, as Judith Herman puts it. It is unspeakable. It is an atrocity. Simultaneously, the victim, who is, by definition, in the CPTSD situations, less powerful, doesn't want it spoken of because it's unspeakable, because the victim doesn't even often want to acknowledge that it was done and would rather keep it in a box somewhere. I have a couple books that I'm basically done with that I've not sent to publishers yet. And one of them is called The Boy in the Box. And if you don't mind, I want to read just a little bit of the beginning of that. It's on this topic. So it starts with an epigraph by, I don't know how to say his name, Gabor Mate. From the Latin word vulnerare, to wound, vulnerability is our susceptibility to be wounded. This fragility is part of our nature and cannot be escaped. The best the brain can do is to shut down conscious awareness of it when pain becomes so vast or unbearable that it threatens to overwhelm our capacity to function. The automatic repression of painful emotion is a helpless child's prime defense mechanism and can enable a child to endure trauma that would otherwise be catastrophic. The unfortunate consequence is a wholesale dulling of emotional awareness. And you'll notice all four of these authors I've been quoting are all basically saying the same thing. And then two more epigraphs for chapter 1 of the book, one by Susan Griffin. The mind can forget what the body, defined by each breath, subject to the heart beating, does not. And the second is the capacity for dissociation enables the young child to exercise their innate life-sustaining need for attachment in spite of the fact that principal attachment figures are also principal abusers. That was Warwick Middleton. So the book begins, when I was a child, my father was extremely violent. He broke my sister's arm. My brother has epilepsy from blows to the head. He raped my mother, my sister, and me. None of us survived. Oh, we continued to breathe. Sometimes, and you know the times, as shallowly as possible, so we could move as low as possible, so we could be as unnoticed and unnoticeable as possible. Continued sometimes to sit bolt upright, unmoving except for wide, unblinking eyes that jumped to any movement. Continued to eat, like the time my father left over the dinner table to get at my brother, and I continued to try to eat because that's what you do at the table, and because I didn't want to be noticed. But did we survive? I don't know, because I don't know who we would have been without my father's teachings. But I know one thing. We each in our own way learn to persist. We learn to be mules, to be impervious to whatever happened. Oh, we'd break, and we'd plead, and we'd cry, and we'd run, but somewhere inside each of us stood a mule who could and would take every blow and not give an inch. Or put another way, inside of each of us was a box into which we could climb, where we could not be touched. Like I said, none of us survived. I don't know what was inside my siblings' boxes. I've never asked. Inside of mine were stars and the irrigation ditch behind the house and the meadows beyond that, full of meadowlarks, garter snakes, cottonwoods, grasses, grasshoppers, ants. The boxes of some people are full of music. Others are full of words, stories, books. Some are full of paintings. Some are full of beautiful places. Some are full of pets or other animals. Here's what I learned about boxes as a child. The box must be strong enough to withstand any amount of battering, yet small and light enough to be with you always. It must be constructed such that you can dive inside almost instantaneously, faster than a slap, certainly faster than a door quietly opening and shutting in the dark. And you need to train yourself to be able to find that entrance to the box no matter what else is going on. You need to be able to move instantly from deep sleep. Wait, sleep can be deep? Who knew? And dive into the box with no discernible transition from sleeping to waking. You need to be able to get into the box while running and dodging. You need to be able to get into the box while sitting on the couch watching someone else get beaten. Get into the box without moving a muscle. The box is transparent and permeable, so that at every moment you can see and hear and feel everything. And I mean every slightest hint of movement, every slightest change in musculature that might indicate a change in mood that goes on outside the box. Your life depends on this. At the same time, the box must be completely opaque and impermeable, such that you're able to protect yourself from even the slightest awareness of what's happening to everyone, including yourself, outside the box. Your life depends on this as well. The box must simultaneously allow you to perceive everything and to beware of nothing. The box exists, of course, as a sanctuary. Its most important feature, and in fact its reason for existence, is to provide some place, some thought, some relationship that the perpetrator cannot destroy, which of course makes the perpetrator try all the harder to get into the box or destroy the contents of the box. It must be resilient enough to withstand when the perpetrator attempts to find what you love and use your beloved against you, or destroy your beloved, your pet, your art, your place, whatever it is you hold in your box, whatever it is that keeps whatever parts of you it can alive. And I'll just say this and then I'll stop. The primary feeling from my childhood was not terror, but rather dread. The beatings and the rapes did not directly occupy most of our time. Most of our time was spent probably not differently than any other children are used, playing, reading, doing chores, only with shoulders pinched up to our ears and a hollowness behind our eyes. In fact, when our father wasn't home, things could almost feel what we guessed was normal. He'd arrive and the ceiling would drop from its regular height to 5 feet, then 4, then 3, and keep dropping till we were all crushed between floor and ceiling. Dread, the hollowed out knowledge that what you fear most will come to pass, combined with a brittle hope that if you act just so, in ways incommensurate with the real threat, you can prevent the inevitable. If you clean the dishes spotlessly enough, or if you sit unmoving enough, if you can be quiet or good or invisible or smart or stupid or enthusiastic or indifferent or happy or sad enough, you can in some way placate whatever implacable anger is thrown at you, the dreadful may not happen. And when the dreadful, which has already happened and will continue to happen, happens, as it always does, or rather it does often enough to make you certain it will happen again, and infrequently enough to keep you alive, your false hope it will not happen again, then that's when you go back into the box. No, it's not true. If you're outside the box when the dreadful happens, your box has failed you and you have failed you. You must go into the box each time before the dreadful happens, even if this means you must go into the box instantaneously. Even if this means you must go back in time before the dreadful and then completely erase everything that happened before you got in the box. Even if this means you must completely erase great swaths of your life, because no one can survive the dreadful. No one. So the point I'm getting at with all of that is that trauma creates this bizarre dissociation. And I'm just listening to a book right now about D-Day. And there are all these soldiers in it who are talking about when they're out of battle, they're absolutely terrified. And they said before they went in, they could never have described what it would feel like to have people shooting at you, trying to kill you. And you're shooting at people trying to kill them. And in the midst of it, you go some other place. And consistently, I'm seeing this in these stories about you go somewhere, and then when it's all over, it's like you can remember things, but everything was different. You're in a totally different mind space. One of the lines I really loved that I wrote there was that we have to be aware of everything and aware of nothing. You have to be able to respond to it. You have to stay present enough to be able to respond in the present. But at the same time, and I don't mean this as an insult, you become really stupefied. And then what happened was so awful that many people, most of us, spend the rest of our lives trying to do anything we can to never remind us of what has been lost. Toward the end of that book that I was just reading that's not published yet, I talk about how I tried for years to just pretend that my symptoms of PTSD were just normal. You know, through my 20s and 30s, every night before I would go to bed, I would check the closets, check under the bed. I would put barricades against my door. I was several states from my father. And one day I was like, I don't think most people do this. I still had to rationalize, like, so if a hitman ever breaks in, I'll be safe because I'll have one extra second. I was like, Derrick, you're not like a mafia person. No hitman's ever. And so it's like, this is ridiculous. There's a great line said by, I don't remember who it was, but some guy who said, unquestioned beliefs are the real authorities of any culture. And we can say the same thing with our lives. It's like my sister. My sister didn't know till she was in 8th grade that not every father raped every daughter. And that changes everything when you come to realize that this is not normal. This is not how things are supposed to be. To take this back to exploitation of women or sexual exploitation of women, people talk about prostitution as the oldest profession. It's like what they're doing is they're normalizing it. They're normalizing this and saying that everybody's always done it. I mean, if you want to talk about prostitution as one of the oldest forms of slavery, sure, we can have that discussion. But that's not the same thing as the oldest profession, which implies that women go into it purely voluntarily.
And there's long human evolution before that we disregard because we don't have as much written evidence or all the justifications we make for that.
That's another thing I want to bring up, though, is this book I really hated in the 90s called Demonic Males. You know, it's the caveman idea. You know, the date was the man beats her over the head, grabs her by the hair, and pulls her into a cave. And then they talk about how, you know, as odious as this may seem, it makes sense that for a woman to associate with one strong male, basically so he's the only one raping her instead of everybody raping her, every male raping her. Males are the ones who are doing that. That's naturalizing this behavior. I mean, that may have been true if we would have evolved not as social creatures in clans and in groups. Humans did not evolve such that one woman is walking alone through the plains of Africa. What happened was we were in family groups like buffalo, like great apes.
We want to take a moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the Donate tab. There, you can find ways to financially support us one time or on a monthly basis. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
There's this wonderful term that's used for, I don't remember the name of the group, but there's this matrifocal group who still lives in China.
Pretty sure you're talking about the Moso.
Okay, great. Humans, for good reason, often have exogamous marriage. Traditionally, when you were living thousands of years ago, you'd have exogamous marriage because it's a really stupid idea to marry your sister or cousin or brother or cousin. And if you have exogamous marriage where the man goes to the women, that's almost a guarantee. If the women's group, where the woman is, if it's a matrifocal culture and they themselves don't have rape, then that's pretty much a guarantee that she will never be battered because he's physically stronger than she is probably. And if she's going to get battered, he's going to have to go through her brothers, uncles, cousins, everybody else. For example, my mom, the first time she was beaten was in front of her husband's parents when she was pregnant. There's this really interesting thing I read a while ago about these people who worked at this counseling group for batterers. And one day they thought they'd ask, so what's the ideal amount of time for you to beat your girlfriend? I mean, you beat her on the first date? Like, oh, no. And they were all talking about it really honestly. And figured out basically it's about a year because you got to get your hooks in. And you have to start cutting off her access to her social system. It's much easier for her to stay in it. My mom back in the 50s and 60s, one of the reasons she didn't leave my father was A, divorces weren't a happening thing. B, there weren't battered women's shelters. C, they were religious and you're never supposed to get divorced. And also he had all the money. She had nothing. And she had 3 kids by the time she was 21. And in the 50s, how is a single mother supposed to raise 3 kids at the age of 21? It's completely nuts. This, by the way, sorry to jump all around, but it's kind of what I do. Peggy Reeves-Sande talked about that as being one of the markers of a low rape culture is basically if the women control the food supply. She studied a whole bunch of cultures all over the world. One of the things that makes rape less likely is if the women control the food supply for obvious reasons. Anyway, back to your point about this whole weird dissociation is that R.D. Laing also talked about how if someone succeeds in forgetting about something, it doesn't do them any good if another person keeps reminding them. And therefore, Jack and Jill is the example he uses, it doesn't do Jack any good to forget something if Jill keeps reminding him. So it's much better if he can make her forget too. And it's much better if he can make her feel guilty for bringing it up. And it's much better if he can convince her that it's all in her imagination. So it's basically just gaslighting. It's much better if he can do all of those things to get her to stop bringing it up. I think this is an incredibly important insight. This is one reason that I think that men are insatiably destroying the world. And this combined with avoid plugging a void, this is one reason that men continue to rape and it's never enough, is that every time there is a free and independent, undestroyed, unviolated is the word I'm looking for, being, it reminds him that his power is not infinite. And therefore, when he sees a child who is free, a woman who is free, a forest who, as opposed to that, is unmanaged, he has to violate it because violation is how he constantly maintains his sense of self-superiority. Because how do I know I'm more powerful? Because I do to them and they don't do to me. And this comes, of course, from a profound place of inadequacy and fear. I don't really care at this point. It's a bit late in the game for me to care about the feelings of the perpetrators. But that's one reason that this male violation imperative is so insatiable and will go until there is nothing left in the world. That's why they bomb the moon. That's why they blow up asteroids. That's why they probe the deepest folds of the ocean, is because there can be no place that is, to use the language from the boy in the box, there's no place that can be allowed in the box, that can be allowed to be unsullied. And something else I want to bring up, and Andrea Dworkin talked about this, and Lear Keith has really introduced me to this, and she was where I got a lot of my analysis on this, that one of the brilliant things that patriarchy has done is to merge the urge to power with the power of sex, the power of the orgasm. So to make orgasms based on power over is a multiplicative or exponential effect. And it's made it a self-perpetuating cycle that is leading to the end of the world. I think that's why Bob Jensen called one of his essays, Pornography is What the End of the World Looks Like.
It's amazing how everything that you have said, I have two more questions, and one's kind of more macro and one's more micro. And I've been sitting here as you're talking, deciding which one should go first, but I'm going to go more macro because you're already answering the question that I had, which is, I've heard you talk about the way that patriarchy fuses sexuality with the urge to power, and with the whole world talking about Epstein files right now and the billionaire social club revolving around these sexual crimes. I'm hearing a lot about what men in power do with that power. But I keep coming back to this intuition that I have that the sexual crimes themselves are somehow integral to the creation of this power to begin with. In your books, I love the way that you tell history and you follow these patterns of domination from micro to macro and back again, connecting these seemingly disparate events. So I thought you would be a really good person to ask about this. Like I said, we hear a lot about these crimes as satisfying the sexual urges of the powerful or bribing the foot soldiers with access to women. But I guess what I'm asking is, how does the sexual crime itself and the resulting trauma make individuals and communities peculiarly vulnerable to political environmental destruction? Like, why do militaries use rape as a strategy of war? What does that accomplish for them beyond the sexual gratification? How does it siphon political power from those communities? And how does this play out in people's everyday lives, as well as ecological disasters and global politics?
You don't mess around, do you?
I stayed up very late last night.
I am not going to give you a satisfactory answer for a couple of reasons. One is, there is no satisfactory answer. This is all insane. This is all just... Judith Herman talks about this in Trauma and Recovery, that at base, where survivors' questions come to is why. And it doesn't matter whether it's the Holocaust and survivors of the Holocaust, like, how could this have happened? Or survivors of incest, or survivors of prostitution or rape, insofar as the difference between prostitution and rape. All of these, why? I asked Judith Herman, do perpetrators really believe their lies? And this was 1990s. I asked her this, and I mean this in a good way. She wasn't dismissive at all. She laughed, and she said, I wish we knew. But the problem is that most perpetrators are never caught, and the ones that are caught and imprisoned is like 1%. So you have to either get really unlucky or be really socially inept, I think that's what she said, to get caught. And the ones who do get caught will tell us whatever they think we want to hear. And what do you do when it's at this level, when perpetration is normal? I basically read mysteries and thrillers. And it's extraordinary to me how much it's reinforced, how much violence against women is just absolutely standard. This makes me so angry. What do On the Waterfront, V for Vendetta, Dr. Zhivago all have in common? And Straw Dogs, a bazillion other movies. They all have in common a no means yes rape scene, where the man starts pushing and pushing and pushing, and by the end of the scene, she's pulling him close. And this is just reinforced and reinforced. So why am I saying all this? A discussion that Lier and I have had many times, and we just had yesterday, is about the Epstein stuff or Bill Cosby. So I understand wanting to have a lot of sex. I got no problem with anybody wanting to have a lot of sex. I mean, as long as other people are. And then, like, you get Bill Cosby, where it's like he was a popular figure. And if he wanted to have a lot of sex with a lot of different women, he could have. Presumably, they would have been lined up out the door. Don't know. But what we know, what he did. And I then said to Leah, it's like, I don't get it. It's like, why do you do that? When if I'm going to be with somebody, I would much rather they're moving, that they're enthusiastic. It's like, I've always thought, by the way, that consent, the notion of consent, I think is in sex is terrible. And the reason I think the notion of consent is terrible is that think of how we use it in everyday language. In fact, the example, when I look it up in the dictionary, the example is he consented to a search by a police detective. And I don't know about you, but I don't want my partner to consent with the enthusiasm with which one would consent to a search by a cop. I don't want consent. What I want is enthusiastic participation. And, we always have that same conversation. Leah's like, Derrick, you are not understanding sadism, are you? Because the point is not the sex at all. I mean, well, it is sexual. It's a toxic mimic of sex. But the point is the power, Derrick. You have to understand the point is the power and showing you have the power. It wouldn't have been as good for him. Good is in quotes here, in air quotes. It wouldn't have been as good for him if the women participated. That's not what he was after. What he was after was the domination, was the I can do this to you. I have power over you. And again, I see this expanding into the world at large. I mean, this is how humans consider themselves superior to elephants or to redwood trees or to anybody else, is because we do to them and they don't do to us. This is absolutely fundamental to our perception of the world. But this describes much of our relationship between the sexes too, is that men are superior. Why are men superior? Men are superior because they can do to women and women can't do to them. And it is a profoundly messed up way to go through the world. And this takes us back to the whole trauma. This is exactly the perspective of traumatized people. I don't know how we get out of it. Another interesting thing is that Peggy Reeves-Sande said that another marker of a high rape culture is some sort of ecological dislocation or famine or drought within a previous couple hundred years. We all know that when patriarchal civic societies collapse, the men take it out on women. That's one of the things going on. But the other thing I want to get to is that 200 years, that it takes a long time for society to really change. I think that there's a lot of pushback in the meantime. There are great changes have taken place in the last 50 years. Battered women's shelters, they literally didn't exist. My mom had no access to them in the 50s and 60s. I remember when my mom got divorced in the 1970-ish, and it wasn't until 72 or 73 that she could get, as a divorced woman, a credit card in her own name. So there has been tremendous movement. But I've also talked to a lot of women who say, older women, who say that they are living through the most misogynist time of their lives. I've talked to old lesbians who say that things are worse for women right now than they were in the 50s. These women, I was born in 1960, so I got no clue, but they lived through it. And they say this is worse. That's also really important. This is how social change actually happens, is there are movements forward, and then there's a tremendous backlash. And then they find ways to sneak in the old hatred. We haven't really talked about the society of the spectacle. And that has to come in here somewhere. Because of pornography, it has to come in. And the society of the spectacle is basically, as I understand it, that when you spectate as opposed to participate, the stimulation has to get greater and greater to keep you from getting bored. I mean, I read that, I understood it theoretically, and then when I really understood it was, and I'm going to get graphic here in a second, when I read Randy Schilt's book, And the Band Played On. That book was about the AIDS crisis in San Francisco in the 1980s. Randy Schiltz was gay and died of AIDS, and he participated in the bathhouse culture. And the title of the book was both how the government did not respond as quickly as it could, and also how the gay community did not respond. They're like, look, we were in the closet forever, and now we have this sexual liberation, so we're going to take advantage of it, and you're not going to push us back, even though the disease is killing them. It's a sexually transmitted disease at that point, primarily. So one day, Randy Schiltz is in a bathhouse, and he's leaving, and he sees some guy sitting in a sling and an amputee rubbing his stump against the guy's behind. And, that's kind of weird. And then it occurs to him, and he suddenly realizes this is not an amputee. The guy has his entire forearm up the other guy's behind. And he wonders, how can one get to that point where that seems like a really good idea? What he realizes, and this is when the whole society of the spectacle thing, I understood it, is that if you remove all personal connection from sex, and you still have a lot of it, sex can get really boring. Another being, and I don't care if that being is an alder tree or a mosquito or a banana slug or a human being or an elephant or the dog who is sleeping on the floor next to me, another being is sentient and infinitely complex. And relationships are infinitely complex. And I'm not talking about having sex with trees. I'm talking about just when you're in a relationship. I have lived on this forest for 27 years, and I fall in love with it more each day. And I see new things every day, and it's always surprising me. And every year is different, and every year there's patterns that are the same. And that's what happens in relationships. And if you take all that out, it's going to get boring. You're going to have to spice it up somehow. And so he says in those circumstances, the physical stimulation, it keeps it from getting boring. This is a narrative that we have heard of people's porn journeys a million times, where they start off with just seeing pictures and then they move to more exciting pictures. It gets boring after a while because there's no there. What they're doing is they're attempting to plug a void using a void. And you can't. My introduction to porn, by the way, is really interesting. For whatever reason, it was never a part of my life. I didn't consume it as a teen or in my 20s. It was never something me or most of my friends did. The only time I've really looked at porn was when I was doing the book Culture Make Believe, and I did a chapter on it. And the reason I did a chapter on it is because I knew this woman whose sister and her husband were married, and they would sit in the opposite corners of the room, this is in the 90s, typing in chat rooms, having sexy talk in chat rooms, and then masturbating with the other hand. And it's like, you have a willing partner you're married to right in the room. What are you doing? Oh, I have to tell you the story. So I'm not going to tell you who it is because it's a very famous person. So I happen to sit next to a very famous person. She is an actress who has been called one of the 10 most beautiful women in the world. And she sat next to me because I had done an event, and then there was a dinner afterwards, and I mentioned patriarchy on stage. And so she said, I want to sit next to you and talk to you about that. So she is, like I said, she was on everybody's, top 10 list of most beautiful women, sexiest women, all those words. So as we're talking, she said, I hate porn. And she said, I hate porn so much because I have told several boyfriends that if you're with me, you can't use porn. And they wouldn't stop using porn. She said they would do things that they had learned in porn to her. And it's like, okay, it's an extraordinary story. And it's not. It's an absolutely ordinary story, isn't it? But it's just, okay, let's just forget caring about a woman as an individual. They are literally in bed with, forget beauty standards, forget all that. We're just going to accept those. They are with one of the 10 sexiest women in the world. And she says, I don't want you to look at pictures of other naked women. And they won't do it. And also, you got to figure, she's very famous. She's presumably, unless she's spent all her money on bingo, she's presumably loaded. So we got to presume that they are way above their own weight class and they still can't behave. The addiction is that strong that they'd rather look at naked pictures of other women than be with her. I told that story to my sister, and she said, Derrick, you're not understanding this. The reason they chose the pictures is because then they don't have to engage with an actual honest to goodness woman.
Yeah. Like you said, I can do to you, but you can't do to me. Another human being, another body can affect you.
And another body can say yes and can say no.
Yeah. So we brought it really far out. And like I said, I love the way that you bring these patterns into the macro and the micro. So to bring it back in, I've been reminded recently that there's this double bind that's put on survivors of sexual crime where we're expected to, one, to have lived through bad enough situations and have suffered enough health and life consequences to count as being victims of a crime and to consider that crime worth looking into, and two, to have healed, heavy quotations, that our perspectives seem reasonable to those without these injuries. If our political or social views deviate too far from the status quo, we can be dismissed just uncritically by opponents and allies alike by calling on this unquestioned assumption that traumatized people have clouded or skewed perspectives, that our radical views are evidence of unhealed triggers. It's really maddening because it feels like society will only acknowledge these crimes with the caveat that anyone with firsthand experience is de facto discredited from serious conversations about their social origins and remedies. But I have this belief from my own experience and from studying others' work, like your own, that what our culture calls trauma holds deep information in the body about what violation does, how it works to manipulate individuals and populations. And I believe that survivors have a unique ability to give voice to that body wisdom into the collective consciousness. So this ties back to what we were talking about with language and the severing of voice as a way to perpetuate the violence. Can you speak to the myth that victims of sexual crimes are too traumatized to contribute meaningfully to broad social conversations, and how we can challenge this unquestioned assumption? How can we cultivate cultures that honor and learn from the information that survivors carry in us?
Well, it's another really profound question. And before I go to the main thing, and you may have to remind me of the main thing because I'm 65 and my memory is not what it used to be. But I want to focus in for a second on you putting air quotes around the word heal. One of the most important realizations I had in my own life was that, I tried to ignore my symptoms and naturalize the symptoms. And then I tried to will my way through them. And I tried all sorts of other things, and it didn't work. And telling the trauma story actually did reduce the symptoms greatly, making meaning of the trauma story. I didn't write a language older than words to be therapeutic, but it was tremendously therapeutic. And it was the most difficult thing I ever did in my life. No, it's not true. Taking care of my mom as she died was more difficult, but it was the most difficult thing I'd done to that point. And the symptoms got much worse as I was writing it. And that's a whole nother discussion that I'd be glad to have another time. But several months after writing the book, the symptoms started to recede. That's when I stopped barricading my door. My night terrors reduced greatly. The nightmares went from a couple, 3 times a night to occasional to, I don't know when the last time I had a nightmare was. So that all got better. And Judith Herman talks about that. But that's part of it. But on the other hand, I think the important thing for all of us to remember, and I'm going to say this, and I don't mean this terribly, is that your life ended with the traumatic episodes. That doesn't mean that you can't have another life. And I'm not talking about you. I'll say mine. My life ended. And I think that people, when they go through things that are profoundly traumatic, one's life as one knew it before is over. And that's something that one has to come to terms with and one has to grapple with. Again, that doesn't mean that you can't have a good life. I have Crohn's disease, and there is my life before it really came on and my life after. And it's not the same life. So I was glad you put air quotes around heal, because I will never be the person I would have been had my childhood been normal. And that's true. But I would also not be who I am without having gone through that. And this is basically, I'm sorry about the sexism here, but this is basically the story of the hero with 1,000 faces. This is the story of the hero or heroine journey, that something happens, that you are dislocated, you're spun out, you leave the village, you leave normalcy, and you have to go and you slay the dragon. And what that is in my case, was coming to terms with that, coming to terms with the loss, getting wounded and recognizing those wounds. And then, and here's the key point to all of those journeys, you come back to the community with a gift that you didn't have before. And you come back to the community with a gift that no one else has. You have perception, you have insight that you would not have had before. Because if you stayed in the village, you never would have seen the other side of the mountain. you've walked through hell and you come back and you can attempt to turn that vision of hell, to paint a picture of that hell and to help prevent others. So that's another thing. I asked both Judith Herman separately and Robert J. Lifton about how come some people open out from trauma and some shut down, and how do some people come out of trauma and don't become horrible people, and why do some become horrible people, and why do some people become both? And they both had the same response, which is they both laughed and said, I don't know. And these are like the world's experts on this. They're like, we have no idea. But then after saying that, Judith Herman said, one thing we can say, though, is that oftentimes those survivors who find what she calls a survivor mission end up doing better. And they say, I will never be the same person I was. And I will wake up in terror every night for the rest of my life, but I'm okay. And many of them become quite fierce about these are the sorts of things that I like in my life, and these are the sorts of things I don't like, and become quite clear about being a voice for all of those who didn't make it through. And someone has to tell those stories. And some literally didn't make it through in terms of dying, and some didn't make it through in terms of, we all know victims of childhood abuse who are 6-year-old boys or girls in 70-year-old bodies. And those of us who returned from hell with a voice owe it to them and to all of us to not shut up. So that's that part. Now, can you remind me of the parts I haven't answered about the not listening to the voices and the lack of credibility?
Yeah, the cultural myth that it seems to be, I think what you call unquestioned assumptions of the culture. I've run up against it in all social circles, especially ones that maybe I would least expect it. Advocacy and ally kind of circles, this idea that victims of these crimes have unhealed trauma that skews our view. And so when we come up with solutions or we come up with perspectives that don't align or don't really make sense to people who haven't had these experiences, it can be uncritically dismissed. Just, oh, well, they're very traumatized. And so they're having this extreme reaction, as opposed to taking these points of views as something to learn from. We always try to spin things in a positive on this show, and it's very hard sometimes. What are kind of your ideas about pushing back against that in our daily lives?
So first, I don't recognize a similar thing happening to, say, veterans of wars. Do you think the same thing happens? Oh, we shouldn't listen to your voice because you were obviously traumatized by having your leg blown off in a war. That's not a thing, is it? Or is it?
I don't think it's as prominent in the cultural consciousness as it was at one point.
It seems obvious that, of course, one who has been through a traumatic event could very well be traumatized. And then to dismiss their perspective on the trauma because they're traumatized, I'm having one of those does not compute moments.
Or not even necessarily their views on the trauma, but even on almost on anything. I think I heard you mention in an interview that I listened to recently about somebody saying you're so up in arms about the salmon because of your father.
Oh, right. So the only reason you care about this issue is because you had a bad experience. You got a boo-boo.
Yeah.
Okay, when they said it about me with the salmon, that was just stupid. And when they say that about you, that's just stupid.
It is, but it's so common.
Okay, so here's how I addressed it with the stuff with my father. The way I addressed it with my father is, my father could have been perfect, and that doesn't alter the fact that salmon are going extinct. And I think the same thing applies here. It's like, look, my background could be perfect, and right now there are X number of women being raped. I did the math. Oh my God. The larger New York metropolitan area has a population of more than 20 million humans. That means there are roughly 10 million women. If, as gold standard studies suggest, 1 out of every 4 women is raped in her lifetime, that means that 2.5 million women in that area will have been or will be raped. If each woman lives an average of 78 years and is raped only once in her lifetime, a dubious assumption, that means in the New York metropolitan area, there are 2.5 million divided by 78 equals 32,000 rapes per year, or almost 88 rapes per day, or more than 3.5 per hour. If we include those who are raped not once but repeatedly, think of child sexual abuse survivors, battered or trafficked women, and so on, we can easily increase this number by a few orders of magnitude. And that's not news. That's not on the front page of the New York newspapers every day. 3.5 per hour in the New York metropolitan area. It's like, I don't care what your or my or anybody's childhood was like. That's an atrocity. That's horrible. And we can say, it's just bad. No matter what your background is, you are objective. People, and you know this better than I do, but people said the same thing about Andrea Dorgan. Oh, she's just mad. It doesn't matter. I don't care. I don't care if she's mad. I don't care. Well, I mean, I do care that she had some terrible experiences, but that doesn't alter the reality of what is happening. And what is happening is, I love the word outrageous, because there's rage out. What is happening to women is outrageous. And whatever your background is, I don't care if you had the happiest childhood, happiest adulthood, and you have nothing but wonderful sexual experiences. It's like, this is still bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up Dworkin again, and she was exactly who I was thinking of, in terms of, it's almost like these conversations erase themselves. And I feel like this unquestioned assumption of the people who have survived it have survived something so outrageous that it becomes uncredible. Am I making sense? Like, the conversation closes the door on itself.
Of course it does. Of course it does. And Judith Herman said why in the first two sentences of Trauma and Recovery. Some violations of this social compact are too terrible to utter aloud. This is the meaning of the word unspeakable. And the Jeanette Winterston, unhappy families are conspiracies of silence. And then Pat Conway, it's always been difficult for me to face the truth about my childhood because I prefer a commitment to explore the lineaments and features of history I would prefer to forget. We all want to forget it, personally and collectively. We all want to just put it behind us. And no, it didn't happen. Okay, R.D. Laing, again, a batterer, had the 3 rules of a dysfunctional family. Rule A is don't. Rule A1 is rule A does not exist. And rule A2 is never discuss the existence or non-existence, rules A, A1, or A2. And you, when you speak out, you are violating all of those rules. And you must be punished or ignored. First off is if they can ignore you. And then second, if you can't be ignored, you got to be punished. And you got to be shut up is what you got to be. And I'm not suggesting a conspiracy. It's just, this is how dysfunction works. I keep saying, and this is crazy. I've been writing these books for 30 years and I keep talking about how crazy the culture is. And then I'm surprised when it acts crazy. And I keep begging, can we just have a conversation about the fact that we're killing the planet? And it's like, if we're crazy enough to kill the planet, we're also crazy enough not to be able to talk about it in reasonable terms. Whatever atrocity you want to name against women, all these women getting raped, that if we're crazy enough that we think that somehow that is acceptable, if we're crazy enough to think that it's okay to put in a movie, and this is just mainstream movies, the ones I mentioned, Dr. Zhivago, that if this disgusting man pushes himself on this girl, she's 17 or something, and pushes himself on her, that by the end of the scene, she'll be pulling him close, with her arms around him. If we think that that's okay, I mean, of course we're going to think that's okay if we're doing it. I've brought this up like around Dr. Zhivago for years now, and so many people have pushed back even about that. I can see the filmmaker getting defensive if I talk to him, but it's like random dudes.
Just what you're saying. Yeah, the conversation is shut down so fast. I mean, I guess this is what the concept of taboo is, right? Like, everybody knows what not to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And it's because we want to maintain that stability.
If you pull on this one string, it'll all unravel.
I was talking to this woman from the Olympic Peninsula who loves this river that has no dams on it. It's a wild river from the top to the ocean. And she loves the river, and the river floods every year. And she said every time the river floods, And that's just part of what rivers do. Rivers do not maintain their channels. They writhe like snakes across the landscape. And every time the river floods, she says it breaks her heart because it kills deer, it kills fish, it kills amphibians, it kills trees. And every time the river floods, it makes her really happy because that's how new habitat is created. And then she said the question is long-term habitat gain for short-term habitat loss. And that's why this conspiracy of silence has to be maintained, is because we're all so afraid, we collectively are all so afraid of that short-term habitat loss. I mean, people told me when I was writing A Language Older Than Words, don't write the book. I mean, back off. You're stirring up all sorts of stuff inside yourself. But I had the long-term habitat gain for it. And we have that collectively. So, I interviewed this woman who had helped write and help make statistics for rates of rape across the world. She designs questions. She said that if you ask women, have you been raped? Many more will say no than if you say, has any men ever had sex with you that you didn't want to have? So they design them very carefully to try to get accurate answers. And I originally interviewed her because I was looking up rates of rape around the world, and Egypt is really low. And I was like, how can that be? And then she talked about how there are various barriers. First off, is the woman going to tell anyone? Second, is she going to tell the police? Third, are the police going to take it seriously? Fourth, are they going to then report it in the statistics? And so she said Egypt does not have a much lower rate of rape than Sweden, but there's a much lower rate reported. Why did I say all that? Because at every level, there is this conspiracy to try to not talk about men's violence against women. And I think it's so interesting that I could talk about bringing down civilization. I could talk about taking out dams. I could talk about all this stuff. I never got in any trouble at all. But the stuff that got me in trouble and got me canceled was saying no to men. My loyalty to women is what has gotten me in trouble.
We know what you got canceled for, and we're on the same side. No worries there.
Okay, well, yeah, I said no men in women's spaces.
We just got canceled for that.
And I did a nice little bit of self-censoring there, didn't I?
And that is where my earlier question came from. We just got canceled for guilty by association.
For me?
No, someone else. But also, I mean, we have a stance on this.
We might get in trouble for platforming you, but we're just doing this anyway. This is a grassroots podcast. We don't have any major donors, and that was on purpose.
The whole thing. And here's the thing, is that a friend of mine's a doctor, and he always says, he's also an environmentalist, and he always says, correct diagnosis is the first step toward proper treatment. And if we can't talk about pornography, prostitution, if we can't talk about men's violence against women, if we can't talk about the murder of the planet, if we can't talk about these things, okay, talking about them by itself does not guarantee that we will be able to resolve them. But if we can't talk about them, we can't resolve them.
And this is exactly why this is a big part of my intuition about every conversation that we have. And I feel like I always, no matter what the topic is, I feel like a broken record because I'm always bringing it back to how does this function to create this power? Because I feel like the fact that we can talk about all these other ways of resisting dominance hierarchy systems, but this is the one that nobody can talk about. I feel like there's something there. If you pull that string, everything else will unravel.
As we're seeing with the Epstein case, that's literally connected to like every social ill on the planet. I'm not even kidding.
Well, I was going to say, keep pulling.
Hell yeah.
So we've just talked about people need an unbelievable amount of evidence. A lot of people do before they're ready to get outraged and get active. Like to convince people that this culture is femicidal, ecocidal is hard. And you'd think, people would have to get out of their inertia, considering that, yes, there are, coastal communities somewhere that people can't find on the map that are starving because of unbelievable overfishing. But now, significant parts of California burn down every year now, beyond what's natural in terms of wildfires, right? And you'd think, like, how much more catastrophe do you have to see? How many more Epsteins, P. Diddy's? I could name lots of, German brothel chains that just get busted and busted and busted for trafficking. When are you going to wake up? But I think one problem we have is honestly like controlled opposition. the harm reduction people that go, oh, okay, we'll make it a little easier on the women of the brothels. We'll give them condoms. Oh, we'll make it a little easier on the animal population with the roads. In Germany, we built these toad tunnels so the toads can cross underneath or above the roads. They don't have to go over or just get killed all the time. But we're still destroying the moors, and we're still destroying or keeping in poverty the homelands of the women who supply our brothels. But the people who often stand in the public saying we are the resistance, all they do is harm reduction and like doctoring these tiny details. Managing the misery, we called it that in another episode. A lot of what social workers do now is managing the misery. We're not actually addressing any root causes anymore. So when people do want to get active, they end up with these groups that don't really change anything. And this is part of the problem that drives me up the wall. And I'm sure it does you as well.
Yes, I'm not meaning to disagree with you. I actually think that harm reduction is fine as long as everybody involved recognizes that it is only harm reduction.
Oh, no, totally agree.
The problem is, like you said, when they present harm reduction as a solution.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
I wonder if it's the same working against violence against women. An image that always comes to me for how environmentalists are dealing with the planet being killed, it's an image like a body is brought into emergency room. The heart's still pumping, and they're doing everything they can to save this person's life. They're putting bandages on the wounds, and they're giving them infusions, and they're giving them antibiotics, and they're doing everything, except they're not actually stopping the guy who's continuing to stab the person. I don't know if it feels like that for you. And so I don't have a problem with putting on the bandages, but we shouldn't pretend. It's ongoing. And I agree that a lot of times some of the strongest opposition, oh God, I've gotten thousands of pieces of hate mail over the decades. And almost all of them, I would say, out of, let's say there's 4,000 of them over the last 30 years, let's say 200 of them are from right-wingers. Almost all of them are from lefties, people who you'd think would have been on the ally side. Anyway, one of the reasons I brought up the thing about, I could say I wanted to take out dams, I wanted to bring down civilization, and nobody really cares, is that for a long time, Leah Keith and I have had this friendly disagreement or discussion about which are the most basic power structures that can't be questioned. Is it civilization? Is it agriculture? And is patriarchy? Patriarchy is at the bottom of it. Male enslavement of women is the model for all the other enslavement. And I'm not 100% sure that prostitution is the oldest form of slavery, but it's pretty close. It might be mining or agriculture. Those might be as old, but they're all pretty close. I mean, women have been enslaved and used as, I don't want to say beasts of burden, because I don't think that beasts of burden should be beasts of burden either. Anyway, they've been enslaved for a long time.
The last question that I had was to bring this back into how do you see us as individuals and collectively resensitizing ourselves in the face of all these overwhelming circumstances? Can you leave the listeners with some practical advice for re-embodiment, milestones to look for in that process? Give us some homework.
I remember when I interviewed Judith Herman, she said that people who work with, for example, survivors of prostitution or survivors of domestic violence, she said there's two mistakes. The people who are attempting to help them, whether they're friends or whether they're professionals, there are two mistakes that are often made. And one of them is to just tell them they can get on with their life and that you don't have to worry about it, just things will be okay. And the other one is to try to push them to disclose before they're ready. So I had a lot of resentment against my mom for staying with my father, for even being with my father. And my siblings did too, and they went other directions. Forget one sister, because she was married to an abuser. And the other two really chose, and this happens all the time, they identified more with the oppressor. And this is absolutely standard. It's classic for people to, as adults, go with the abuser instead of the other victim. I felt some resentment toward my mom. We had a really good relationship, but I still felt resentment toward her. At the same time, I got a degree in engineering, and I didn't want to do it with my life, and I wanted to be a writer. And I spent a lot of my 20s pretending I was a writer, calling myself a writer, but not writing very much. I did write one book that never got published, and I wrote some, but not that much. And I made some money, but my mom also supported me a lot. Anyway, so we had a series of discussions when I was about 29 or 30 that were increasingly angry on my part with, why did you stay with my father? And I was the youngest kid by far. And it culminated in this one conversation where she said what she had said many times before, which is, I stayed as long as I did because I knew if I left before you were about 10, he would get you in court because he was really rich. And he would get you in court. And I didn't want that to happen. And I said, so basically what you're saying is that's 10 years of additional beatings and rapes for everybody that wouldn't have happened if I weren't born. So basically, I'm to blame for this. And she said, so do you think that a day goes by that I don't regret decisions I made and didn't make? And I'm sorry. And also, did you ever ask yourself why you had a degree that you could have made a lot of money in, and I supported you? You spent 10 years saying, I'm a writer, and you haven't written very much. Did you ever wonder why I didn't push you? And I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. And she said, it was because I knew that you didn't have a childhood. And if you were ever going to be a productive adult, you needed a lot of time to vomit up the effects of your childhood. And you needed a lot of time to just sit and prepare and figure out who you were and figure out how to move forward. And honestly, and this is no exaggeration, in that moment, all of my resentment toward my mom disappeared for the rest of my life. Oh, she still annoyed me, of course, standard. And I annoyed her too. But all of my resentment disappeared because what more can you ask of someone than that, A, they apologize and regret, and they have done everything in their power to help fix what went wrong and never once held it over you until I backed her in a corner. And another thing she said to me about the Crohn's disease all the time, and has been so helpful to me emotionally too. She said this about various Crohn's flares I would have. It took you a long time to get sick, and it's going to take you a long time to get better. And that is the best advice anybody can give anybody about any of these things. I have friends who have been prostituted, and I have said to them as they struggle, afterwards, it took you a long time to get here, and it's going to take you a long time to get past it. That patience with the body, that's part of what trauma does, is it makes us think that we can will our way through it, just like we willed our way through the trauma. Oh, and I want to say another thing too. This is all really important. I had a friend who didn't know her birthday because her father said, why would we ever want to celebrate that? She was abused. Anybody who knows my story, she was abused 50 times worse. It was just, it's awful, the stuff she endured. And she would sometimes complain to me that she would stay up all night playing Free Cell. And I often said to her, you get a get out of jail free card for anything you do the rest of your life that doesn't hurt others. And I've said this to my sister. It's like, you survived your childhood. If you want to spend the rest of your life playing Farmville, if you want to spend the rest of your life listening to basketball games, go for it. It's like, if you want to do something else, that's great, but you already won at life because you survived. You survived what no one can survive.
Wow, that is so tender. Derrick, thank you so much.
My mom, she watched a lot of TV, and for a time in my 20s, I didn't say anything to her ever, but I would internally judge her for that. And then in my 30s, it's like, same deal for her. It's like, she survived 20 years of my father. She survived 20 years of beatings and rapes. If she wants to watch Judge Judy, that's great,
I'd love to hear you speak about your mother. There's and again, going back to this feeling that I have that there's so much body wisdom, and I feel your mother's wisdom come through every time you speak about her, and it touches my life, and it touches my history in ways that are really deep. And what you said, what really stood out was the support, the mutual support there of, yes, this had to go on in your childhood, but then after your childhood, it's not over. And the way that she was able to be there with you. I'm going through that with my kids now. My youngest is actually turning 18 in 5 days. So today's my birthday, and her birthday is in 5 days. And we're going through that phase of unpacking and saying, what do we do now? And how do we move forward as a family unit and out into our community? And that tender message of patience and the slowness of this and the way that the disruption happens over generations and the reconnection happens over generations as well. It's a really good reminder. Thank you.
Yeah. My mom said many smart things to me, and the thing about taking a long time to get sick and a long time to get better is one of the smartest.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.